Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SitRep. SitRep is an notorious open source intelligent app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SitRep, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. Today is another installment of our segment, Global Intel, where we look at several different topics and how they affect U.S. foreign policy and international politics. My name is Matt.
And I am Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias.
So first up today, we're going to be looking at the situation between the United States and Venezuela. So recently, President Trump and the U.S. military ordered a strike that hit a vessel in the Caribbean, killing 11 people. The administration is saying that this was conducted as part of anti-narco trafficking operations. We have been seeing a buildup in the area for a while from the U.S. Navy, but clearly this has created and increased more tensions between the United States and Venezuela. So, Stefano, this being, one of the regions and one of the topics that you focus on quite a bit, if you could just walk us through first what exactly this strike looked like and what's been the immediate fallout and where do you see this going?
No, yeah, thanks, Matt, for the question. And I would recommend our listeners, before kind of a lot of even the military strikes, et cetera, when the buildup started to happen, we had SA Defense on. It was the interview I did with him, and we kind of covered Venezuela. This was the previous episode on Bluff. So by all means, I recommend all our listeners, if you haven't listened to that episode, please do. Gives a lot of the context of what's going on. One of the things that SA Defense kind of alluded to, based on kind of the original once this report is coming on, he anticipated that this was going to be a short-term show of force. That was kind of his belief, and I think the strike against the speedboat kind of put that aside, and it looks like this is going to be a longer-term deployment in operation. The strike, President Trump announced that the strike targeted the foreign terrorist organization Tren de Aragua, which was designated under the Trump administration of February of this year. Tren de Aragua now has this very common name in U.S. politics. They're a Venezuelan prison gang based out of, they kind of started out in a region, just as their name suggests, Aragua. That's where they kind of originated from Venezuelan prisons. And then because of a lot of the humanitarian crisis and the refugees fleeing the Maduro regime, Tren de Aragua has been able to leverage that to kind of spread their influence in large areas around the Western Hemisphere, specifically across South America, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Chile. I say this, the first time, through my account, All Source News, that I tracked Tren de Aragua was May of 2023. And the reason why it was my first post, even though I was tracking them before, is we started to see opinion polls in Chile highlighting an increased concern about security. And Chile is a very safe and secure country in South America. And so if you had the public opinion polls kind of highlighting the concern of security, that's something newsworthy. And one of the large areas of that was because of, Tren de Aragua, the gang. So I think it's important to note that clearly President Trump is going to be much more involved in the Western Hemisphere. We've already seen earlier in his second administration, the Office of Director of National Intelligence during the 2025 threat assessment highlighted drug trafficking organizations in the Western Hemisphere as being the primary threat to the United States. Politico reported that the new national defense strategy that's currently in Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War, I guess, Pete Hegseth's desk, is now prioritizing Homeland Security and Homeland Defense and prioritizing the Western Hemisphere. And we've really seen the employment of U.S. military forces now kind of centered around the Western Hemisphere, with the Caribbean being a key aspect. President Trump also, in addition to the naval assets, we saw the deployment of 10 F-35 stealth fighters to Puerto Rico. That was in response, it looks like, I think it was already planned, but I think they really highlighted that because the Venezuelan military did fly already twice this week. Their F-16s have kind of flown overhead over U.S. Navy destroyers and what the U.S. Navy terms, unprofessional and risky maneuvers. And Puerto Rico looks like it's going to be one of the main bases of operations for this kind of Southcom Caribbean Sea deployment. Again, I think the deployment into the Caribbean clearly is directed against Maduro, right? And I think there is a counter-narcotic portion of this. What's important to highlight is in 2024, and in 2025, we've actually seen record drug seizures through maritime routes in the Caribbean, not only by the U.S., but a lot of our allies and partners in the region. The French Navy in January 2025, if memory serves me correctly, seized over 9 tons of cocaine in a maritime shipment, which, some of the reporting actually after that seizure in 2025 actually did apparently cause some issues in kind of these Colombian FARC dissident groups and ELN, where they started to have clashes in kind of the remote border regions between Colombia and Venezuela. And it looks like it might have been tied to actually that drug seizure because of the huge loss of economic resources tied to it, right? So there has been significant increase of naval assets and Coast Guard assets, again, from allied and partners and even the U.S. into the Caribbean for counter narcotic operations. And it has had some level of impact. This is different, though, because of the deployment of the MU, the Marine Expeditionary Unit. Now you have F-35s there. Clearly, that is not designed for any way, shape, or form counter cartel narcotic operations in the Caribbean Sea. This looks like it's significantly more towards Maduro, and we've even seen reporting from the Trump administration highlighting how they want to give options to President Trump, and he's even considering conducting strikes inside of Venezuela in areas that are known for drug trafficking and narcotics as a way to kind of force Maduro even out of power through kind of their own internal regime aspect. The Justice Department put a bounty of $50 million on Maduro, highlighting that he's the leader of the Cartel de los Soles. In English, that's called the Sun Cartel. I think it's important to note that unlike, let's say, the Sinaloa cartel, right, Matt, where we've talked about, or the Jalisco New Generation cartel, right, that actually uses that nomenclature. They used it in their propaganda. There's no such thing technically as the Sun Cartel. What the Sun Cartel is the Venezuelan military. The reason why the U.S. calls it the Sun Cartel is because the sun is the emblem of the Venezuelan military. So instead of saying the Venezuelan military is a drug trafficking organization, they just gave them the name, the Sun Cartel. And we've seen countries, following the U.S. lead, we've seen countries designate the Sun Cartel as a foreign terrorist organization. We saw Argentina do it. We saw Ecuador do it. We see the Dominican Republic do it. And I believe even Peru did it, where they declared the Sun Cartel as foreign terrorist organization following the U.S. kind of pressure campaign. The Venezuelan military, led by Maduro specifically, is heavily involved in drug trafficking. I mean, it's been a known fact in how they do it, not only to the United States, but to Europe as well, and is a key conduit for drugs, leveraging the cocaine produced in Colombia, FARC dissident groups, the Ejército Liberal Nacional, or the ELN, to ship it over to the rest of the world, and the Venezuelan military does it. And when you're analyzing Venezuela from kind of the gangs and organized crime and cartel aspects that operate in Venezuela, I think it's important to note that there's various degrees of relationships between these groups and the Venezuelan regime. There's some groups that work side by side, almost like a strategic alliance and partnership with the Venezuelan regime. For example, the ELN, that is well known to be just an extension of the Maduro regime, and they have extensive relationship. Tren de Aragua, for example, though, is kind of in between that. We do know of dealings between the Maduro regime and Tren de Aragua, more so related to the handling of Venezuelan prisons, where the Venezuelan government kind of takes a step back and allows gangs to run prison as long as violence goes down and is not kind of a problem. But if there's some sort of line crossed, we have seen the Venezuelan military kind of go into the prisons and kind of restore kind of what they would consider their order in there. So there is some relationship between Tren de Aragua and Maduro, but not to the extent of, let's say, ELN. And then there's other gangs, for example, the Tren de Llano, which is an open conflict with the Venezuelan government. And it's funny because Tren de Llano is a gang that kind of took this nomenclature of freedom fighters and fighting the oppressed and fighting the Maduro regime and trying to really highlight that political nature. But for all intents and purposes, they're just a gang. And so, again, there's a wide spectrum of how the Maduro regime deals with gangs and organized crimes and other terrorist groups. And it's all in between, from strategic alliance to open hostility and everything in between. But clearly, I think President Trump, is seriously considering military action against Venezuela directly. I think this is going to fit within the mold of the prioritization of the Western Hemisphere for U.S. national security. And I think Maduro is the prime target for the U.S. and the Trump administration to go after because of the well-known established fact of Maduro's relationship with drug trafficking. He has been indicted in the United States by a grand jury. We've seen family members of Maduro serve time in prison in the U.S. and pleading guilty for drug trafficking. So I think that's a well fact. And I think the deployment in the Caribbean is geared towards Venezuela and not necessarily anywhere else, Mexico, Haiti, Ecuador, et cetera. Venezuela is obviously next in the chute, and we're seeing that clearly ramp up.
So there are a few different things that I guess are more questions for you. But when thinking about, you were mentioning that previously the discussion on this podcast had been that this might be sort of a short-term show of force. Do you see this as part of the larger paradigm shift that the United States is undergoing right now, especially when it comes to what Trump considers our neighborhood? So, you could call it almost like a neo-Monroe doctrine.
I think this is a situation where we might have discrepancies between, and this isn't the first time this has happened within the Trump administration, right? Where there might be discrepancies within the Secretary of Defense, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, specifically, the Undersecretary for Policy, Colby. We all know Elder Colby, very active on X, and kind of maybe other elements within the Trump White House, right? I do believe, because President Trump, for example, had the Polish president or prime minister recently in the White House, and even said, we're maintaining our military footprint in Poland, and we will even increase it if the Polish government requests it. Obviously, Poland has been a very good ally of President Trump specifically. I and again, the reporting from Politico of the National Defense Strategy, where they're kind of reprioritizing the Western Hemisphere, you know, people can say that, and that could be in a policy paper, and then crisis happens around the world, and the priority shifts. I mean, look at the U.S. bombing of the Iranian nuclear facility, right, and everything that happened in the Middle East. There was a substantial deployment of U.S. military power in the CENTCOM AOR to address that acute threat, right? And I think that's the scenario. I do believe that what the Trump administration is kind of interested in, at least in the European side, is having Europe lead it more, and where U.S. becomes more of an enabler, not the lead, right? And there's all these back and forth and the sanctions with Putin, et cetera. But at least from the construct of U.S. military and aid commitment to Ukraine and to Europe, that has maintained, if not increased, even. Now that is not being framed politically as foreign aid, but the purchasing of U.S. military equipment and kind of investment tied, we are seeing that substantial amount of equipment. And then the recent coalition, the Willing meeting that was hosted by our European allies, Trump did call in and specifically called out Slovakia and Hungary, saying, hey, stop buying Russian oil. A lot of the tariffs against India was also kind of related to that. So again, I wouldn't necessarily read too much the deployment in the Caribbean as being a fundamental shift of U.S. posture. I do believe they are increasing its importance. And I think that's something. I think Marco Rubio did do a visit recently to multiple South American countries, for example, Ecuador, where he added two new groups to the foreign terrorist organization, which are called Los Choneros and Los Lobos. Those are two very powerful Ecuadorian gangs that really cause a lot of violence. And we are seeing a lot of South American countries kind of jump, following the political alignment of the United States. Again, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Peru, Argentina. We are seeing that, and obviously the U.S. relationship with Bukele and El Salvador. So I think what we're seeing is this deployment in the Caribbean, I think is geared towards Maduro. I think it is geared towards, I think we are going to start seeing an increased amount of operations targeting these foreign terrorist organizations declared by the Trump administration, for example, Trinidad Agua. It would be interesting to see if they actually start targeting actual Venezuelan institutions inside of Venezuela, because again, the Sun Cartel is the Venezuelan military. That's who they are. And so that I wouldn't necessarily say that this is a fundamental paradigm shift yet in American military power. And in the end of the day, Pete Hegseth can sign a national defense strategy saying we're not going to prioritizing deterring China. And we've seen President Trump being, pretty hawkish on China as well, with the tariffs, maybe more dealings, et cetera. So I think this is an interesting dynamic where this is the first time since probably the invasion of Panama, where we've seen a huge military buildup of U.S. military forces in the Southcom AOR and the Caribbean. I think this mirrors it, but just as the invasion of Panama in 1989 was then subsided completely by the Gulf War, this might be one of the scenarios where this is the focus now. I don't think we can necessarily anticipate if this is a fundamental shift or just a momentarily shift right now, because we don't know really what the geopolitical situation could be 6 months to a year from now.
And to follow up on that, Do you worry at all? You mentioned the Trump administration has expanded to naming more of these narco groups as terrorist organizations. You've got the of the Sun, where we're working basically against a state actor. So we're seeing the lines of, what is terrorism, what is independent sovereign state, and what are these narco criminal organizations, but they're all falling now under the umbrella of terrorist organizations. Do you worry about the implications of that, what that might mean down the road? And as we ratchet up pressure on Venezuela, how do you see them planning some sort of retaliation? What do you see them looking abroad for additional support? Do you see any sort of true conflict between the United States and Venezuela, or do you think that this is not necessarily a remember the main type moment for Venezuela, but something that is going to be a speed bump in a very bumpy relationship already?
I think the key question there is, what course of action President Trump decides to take related to Venezuela. Is this a scenario where they just conduct military operations against, speedboats and narcotic smuggling in the Caribbean along international waters, or is there something more direct against Venezuela? Regardless, and in the end of the day, let me make this abundantly clear. If President Trump, for example, wakes up tomorrow and decides regime change is the goal of the United States against Venezuela, there's nothing Maduro can do. Nobody's going to come to his side. Russia couldn't even save Bashar al-Assad, which was a much more strategic partner for Vladimir Putin than Nicolas Maduro halfway around the world for Russia, right? China's not going to do anything, et cetera. At the end of the day, if the United States decides to take and go full on regime change in Venezuela, I don't think there's really much that Maduro can do to kind of change that situation, that calculus on the ground. Clearly, the deployment of military forces in the Caribbean is not geared towards an actual invasion of Venezuela. You're not going to invade Venezuela with 4,000 Marines, which is the kind of the contingent of the MEU. But it's more of, probably leveraging naval and air power to achieve certain goals. And the thing about Venezuela, a lot of our strategic assets can execute those operations directly from the United States, the CONUS, mainland the United States, right? And so there's obviously a lot more resources available for the U.S. for an operation in Venezuela that Maduro just can't do anything about it. Kind of the broader question, what I find it interesting is what the U.S. government is doing, similar to the FTO designation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran. I think the line between state actor and non-state actor with FTO designation, that is long in the past. That has already been pushed away and moved to the past. Regardless if you're a state actor, if you're doing activities that within the U.S. government we perceive as being tied to terrorism, you're going to get that foreign terrorist designation. The interesting aspect, obviously, here is kind of the narco sense, because these are really a lot of times are more criminally aligned. And in the end of the day, we can go into the semantics. FTO designation, I think people need to understand something, does not automatically give authorities, at least it's not this magical wand that you get an FTO designation enabling the president to conduct military actions. At least if you're analyzing this from the War Powers Act, right? President Trump can order military operations against anywhere around the world at his whim as the chief executive, right? The War Powers Act kind of has a constraining from a funding perspective for 60 days before Congress gives more authorization. I don't necessarily see Congress really stepping in to stop or halt any of these types of military operations overseas. So this falls well within the parameters of the second, the powers of the executive branch. So, I think that's something that we're analyzing, and we can talk about the policy aspect of all that. These are narcotic groups, they're profit driven. They're not lumping them with political organizations. The FTO designation, what it does is it gives, first of all, the State Department is the one who handles it. So that's why it's not this magical wand for military authorities. The State Department manages. They're the ones who designate it. It's up to the decision of Marco Rubio. He's the one who signs it, right? And then from there, it enables the Justice Department or in the Department of Homeland Security broader authorities from law investigation purposes. Actually, recently, because of the designation of Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organization, what the Attorney General Pam Bondi actually recently, the U.S. seized over 300 tons of chemical precursors in the ports of Houston that was destined for the Sinaloa cartel. right? And what the Justice Department said is based on the FTO designation, we had much more broad authorities and investigative powers at our disposal to kind of execute that. That's really all it kind of changes, right? How the U.S. operates with these cartels and gangs kind of is still in the same construct. It's just the FTO designation does give broader authority and leeway to U.S. investigation intelligence agencies to conduct operations. And I think that's basically it. And everything else kind of falls within the realm of semantics. Because I can tell you right now, in Ecuador, when the gang violence got really bad in 2024, the Ecuadorian people were calling these gangs terrorists. Actually, the United Nations kind of stepped on their foot with this because when the gang violence exploded in Ecuador, what happened was the United Nations released a statement kind of highlighting the concerns for human rights, highlighting the concerns of state overreach, all these kind of these standard kind of things about concerns about all these issues that I mentioned. And the Ecuadorian public was actually furious with the United Nations because what they said is you never release any of these communiques directed against the gang members when they cause a lot of violence to go up. Right when they attack us and we respond, this is when you come in. And I think that's something that I've been very critical of a lot of these organizations when they analyze it, which is in the sense that if you're only going to criticize, which is fine, you can focus on police brutality, human rights violation, et cetera, across the Western Hemisphere when the state is doing it. But if the problem is the only time you bring that up is when the state responds, you run the risk of losing the civilian population because you come out as a hypocrite. And I think that is kind of this broad sense of the semantics. We can maybe have a policy agreement, but what I would about FTO designation for cartels, about profit margin or profit motive or political motives, what I can tell you that inside of Mexico, they don't care about that difference. They view them as terrorists because of the impact they had. And I think that's where we need to kind of zoom out from some of this conversations and this rhetoric and understand that, yeah, we can have that policy debate, but I can tell you right now in Ecuador, they're probably very happy that Los Lobos y los Choneros were declared foreign terrorist organization because of the violence they brought into the country.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult position to be in because an organization, a non-state actor, does not have to be a terrorist organization to cause great harm to the populace. I think that is just an easy label. But going back to what you're saying about the executive power and what this does and does not allow for, um, I think that is actually where maybe semantics are less important, as you were saying, in terms of this label, because it builds sort of a understanding of these organizations within the US public, and based on the current makeup of Congress, these sort of expanded war powers that have continued to fall more and more into the court of the executive since 9/11. I don't think anyone is there to necessarily stop or plead to Trump's better instinct to not make a strike if he does wake up one day and decide that that is going to be the case. So I think you're dead on there. One of the things that I worry about with the United States, though, is we're talking about this cartel of the Suns in Venezuela and the government and the ties to these organized criminal groups, when at the same time we've been bringing Bukele more into the fold, and there's evidence, it's more or less understood that he has worked with criminal organizations to sort of stem the flow of violence and given them preferential treatment and control of the prisons, kind of like what you were saying with Maduro. So it's this historical tension between the United States and Venezuela that I think is really the driving factor here. And a lot of that is around just this history of the Cold War and this view of communism. And we've put very heavy sanctions on them. And like you said, Russia is very far away and probably not going to be able to really influence this situation. I do wonder if China has, any real interest in this. But again, that distance, that's quite the geographic modifier that's going to make that very difficult for the Maduro regime to receive any sort of relief in this situation.
And actually, if I think this is a perfect opportunity to kind of go to the next area of our conversation because you alluded to China. And we just recently saw the conclusion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's meeting and the summit. It does look like this was, I think a lot of people are portraying it as, the SEO is trying to pick up the mantle or be the counterweight to a lot of kind of the disorder and chaos of a lot of the Trump presidency's decisions related specifically to tariffs, at least in this global front, kind of a lot of the political and international tensions and chaos we're seeing. And it does look like Xi Jinping really tried to leverage this SEO summit to be kind of that counterweight. I think it's also important to highlight before we go specifically to the SEO summit is that the Chinese People Liberations Army military parade that recently occurred in Beijing. We did see Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, and Kim Jong Un, the president of North Korea, the dictator of North Korea, also attend that and kind of show these three countries together. And then the SEO summit was much more broader. Obviously, the Indian prime minister, but the Indian president was there. And so, I'd like your takes kind of on kind of what are the things that you saw, Matt, in this latest SEO summit that kind of caught your attention. Clearly does show, at least in what I perceive, is that Vladimir Putin is trying to maximize all these summits to kind of show he isn't isolated, because we did see, for example, the Turkish President Erdogan and Putin meet at the sidelines of the SEO summit. So, what were the broad things that you noticed? My key takeaway is Putin is trying to show he's not isolated internationally.
So the SCO, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, recently held this summit in Tianjin. And I believe there were about 20 attendees. So you had all the stands, you had Russia there, you had North Korea, Iran, India. And that India being there is one of the things that I think is really important to look into. We saw very chummy relationships with Putin, Modi, and Xi. We even saw Putin and Modi holding hands, which was a little bit awkward. But what this tells me is we are seeing a large portion of the global leaders who are ruling over, or the countries that compose something like 40% of the world's population. We're seeing them sort of coalesce, and it looks like that they are coalescing around China. And so we had this organization, which I believe there are about 10 official members, but we had a lot of the satellites who were also there having discussions that seemed very targeted, and built on this ire that is developing among parts of the international community targeted against the United States. And a lot of that comes from the tariffs. I think a lot of it comes from the unpredictability. And this served as an opportunity for Putin to show again this sense of unity, that not only was he just meeting with Trump, now he's meeting with Xi and Modi. And we see a lot of the conversations that are happening there are targeted around getting around and countering US sanctions and US foreign policy. So the two things that I'm really interested in, and there were plenty of different topics that we can touch on here, but the two big ones is this conversation around AI, and then this sort of deepening of the ties between India, China, and Russia. So I think starting just with AI, it seems that there's this really big push from China to catch up to the United States. And that is what they're doing, with the end goal being the country that supplies this AI technology to the globe and to as many foreign countries as possible. That is a strategic aim, because when you think about this, especially if this is technology coming from China, you can guarantee that there are going to be backdoors built into it. And there are going to be different use cases that China is going to be okay with that the United States would not be, and vice versa, obviously. And then in this conversation, you also have to look at, is one of those countries maybe India? Now, we have spent a long time in the United States trying to develop a strategic relationship with India. For the longest time, they were getting their arms from Russia as the primary supplier by a mile. And we've seen this even recently with deals like, acquiring the S400s, and written into that contract was that when the S450s were developed, they would get those as well. At the same time, they were trying to also get F-35s from the United States. Those relationships have soured between the United States and India, and it has happened very quickly. And it seems that Trump has this interest in both appearing to play hardball with China, but also sort of an affinity towards the leaders in China and Russia. So I guess first I would be interested in your takes on AI, because I do think that this is obviously something that Artorias is very focused on, but sort of the next step in what is going to be uh, an arms race of sorts and a global supplier. And that is going to affect a lot of foreign policy in the future, as technology often has. For example, Taiwan and the manufacturing of chips that are needed to drive this technology. So with that said, what is first your take on AI and what China was trying to accomplish here?
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting you bring up the AI piece because I remember when I was monitoring the summit, I actually got an alert from because one of the countries obviously I track is also Brazil, and Brazil, one of the high alerts that we got from SITREP was kind of this project of doing kind of this BRICS AI aspect under the construct of the SEO. Look, I think that the problem set that these countries are running into, right? Because the Brazil under BRICS and the SEO, and you can kind of like run into a situation where maybe some of these even are a little bit somewhat interchangeable, right? First, the SEO was kind of designed in more of a security aspect, but and when it first was founded, people were like, "Oh, is this the counter NATO?" And obviously, it's never going to get to that point. And I think that's the problem, that even in this construct of AI, the United States and Europe, I do believe, are leagues ahead. You do see China trying to follow suit and expand on their capabilities of AI. But in the end of the day, when they're looking at it from a multinational perspective or a coalition and stuff like that, the problem with the SEO and just with BRICS is, from an economic sense, we haven't really seen deep integration within their economies, and fundamentally, they're not compatible in many aspects because a lot of them are mostly export driven. Well, they're all export driven economies. That's the fundamental problem. And what we've seen is Xi Jinping has not transitioned his country into a consumer based economy, but doubled and tripled down on export base. And this hope and idea that this was somehow revolutionize and revitalize the Chinese economy, which will not happen. And they're kind of stuck in this middle income trap. And so I think we have to be clear, there's always going to be statements made. The question I would be looking at is what actions are happening. And it's always this interesting aspect that when we're analyzing China, when we're analyzing specifically China, but all these countries, it's always interesting to analyze. There's more commitments than actually money spent. And this is one of those scenarios where it looks like where this is a case where you have multiple countries meeting. Yes, maybe to show solidarity against Trump's tariffs. And we've been very critical, and obviously the problems and the economic problem sets that the Trump tariffs have brought, not only to the world, but to US specifically. One of the issues that people are actually starting to be worried about and concerned about because of the Trump tariffs is this issue of stagflation, which I think people can't discount. With unemployment might be rising, job growth slowing, slower economic growth, but inflation still being persistently high. But in the end of the day, when we're analyzing all these other countries, there's always pledges. How does that necessarily then actually transition to actual arguments? I do believe China is a key player in the future of AI, but that's really the end of it. They require, because we see all these other countries, people always talk about, like, for example, Saudi Arabia and the GCC really trying to expand AI. They require Western or international companies to really make these countries much more effective in these systems, but they're reliant on others. So the SEO commitment, the BRIC commitment in AI, and this idea that it's going to cause an AI race, there's already the largest companies in the world, most all of them based basically in the United States, really dominate the AI industry. And it's not as easy as I think people believe, in which they can kind of expand into that. And this is one of the regions where I think it's just talking points, semantics, and pictures for the press. I would be much more interested in looking at what actual decisions are made because we've seen both the SEO, specifically the SEO, probably much worse so than BRICS. The SEO has been very much an ineffective body in any way, shape, or form, other than an opportunity to leaders to meet and discuss things that really have no practical implication, not only regionally or locally, but internationally.
So here's where I would push back on that. I think the mere existence of the SEO and interest in it from countries like India is a way of, if not pushing their own policies forward, undermining the policies then of the United States and undermining those alliances that we've worked so hard to build. When it comes to China, I agree that this is the type of thing, and the interests of these countries are not always going to align. And a lot of the times you're going to see them sort of go their own way. One of the important ways to differentiate the SEO from, the European or Western sort of alliance that you see with NATO is there's no defense guarantee. And you wouldn't want a defense guarantee with such a group of, bellicose individuals like Putin or what you've seen with Kim Jong-un. But at the same time, the fact that they're all meeting at the same table, the fact that they are building these sort of chummy relationships that are going to allow them to go and seek their individual aims is very important on the world stage. I agree with the economy aspect, especially, again, they're trying to move away from the dollar. We've heard this quite a bit in the past. Nothing's really come from it. I didn't see anything that indicates that anything is really different this time around. What we do see is China is pledging more money and funds into development internationally, which at the time that USAID has pretty much completely disappeared. Uh, that is something that looking at the developing world, where it won't take a ton of money to cause a real impact in those areas and just solidify a little bit more support. So, like, yes, a lot of this stuff might be happening at the margins, but at the end of the day, it is just sort of another crack in the US global hegemony. And it's something that I would continue to watch. Speaking specific to AI, the technology, I agree that China is further behind, and it's not going to be easy for them to catch up necessarily. But it's definitely not something to sleep on. And as part of those ambitions, that's where I think things like their interest in Taiwan and the chips industry there, and with the support and unity, no one's going to necessarily stand in their way. Don't necessarily know where the United States stands. It's like strategic ambiguity on a whole new level. Do they make a move on Taiwan in potential advancement of their AI goals? So I agree that
But
it's
can I
not.
just push back just
Yeah, of
on
course.
I think okay, so because I hear okay, like one India, yes, it's been a goal since specifically in the 2000s, right, to make India a strategic partner and all that. And look, obviously there is a lot of areas of cooperation. This latest tariff things, look, not the first time that U.S. and India has suffered diplomatic tensions, and won't be the last. I think it's important to highlight India has always prioritized strategic autonomy over anything else. And we have seen them divesting from Russian military equipment, but mainly because I think the Indians saw the failures of Russia's military equipment in Ukraine and decided to look at other avenues and areas to kind of expand on that, right? Look, India is always going to have a significant degree of strategic independence in their aspect. They're both a member of the BRICS, they're a member of the SCO, and they're also a member of the Quad, right? That's just how India operates. And I think that's something. India's primary strategic threat will be Pakistan and China. The question is who's first and who's second, and that depends on the day of the month of the year. That is not going to change in the construct of India's national security or even economic security. So yes, leaders meeting together is great. We've highlighted how that's a problem even with President Trump and Putin in Alaska. This idea that personal relationship can really impact global politics. I have never been a believer of that, that there's much more severe things. And I view the SEO thing as simply that. It's just okay, here's leaders and people to take pictures. Nothing necessarily meaningful comes from it. India will always have a relationship with China and Putin, no matter what we decide or what we want to do. And these meetings, just as the Trump Putin meeting produced nothing of value, personal relationship between leaders, I have always been much more skeptical and not that. And then the issue of China is, again, it goes back to my main criticism of China. It is that they love to talk, they love to host, and then nothing comes out of it. We've even seen the Thailand Cambodia, which we've covered on this episode. China did not play a role in achieving a ceasefire. DRC Rwanda, China has not played a role in any of those types of things. And look, we've highlighted the problems with the M23 offensive and how that, the war, although President Trump loves to say he got peace, the war is still going on. Again, it just goes back to, I think, what China has kind of, I think and has taken a lesser, I think the wolf warrior diplomacy has somewhat tempered down, not completely, maybe just a little bit. Now they're trying to come back in this area for meetings and summits, etc. But they're never going to put the weight from an international perspective that clearly the United States has. And I think that's the fundamental difference. And so I'm concerned about when we're analyzing the geopolitical situation currently within and the specifically the role in the United States. I would agree with you that the United States is being much more inward looking and much more regional focused. I would agree with that. And I would agree with the problems as the tariffs and other countries trying to figure out ways to solve it. My issue is this we've had the conversations for decades of when I remember when I was in college, when the question was when, not if, China was going to be the largest economy in the world. And now that's never going to happen because China has already hit the peak. And I think the problem set now that people are running into is they're now doing this from a diplomatic sense. Yes, the increased influence within the United Nations. Yes, the increased influence of all these other organizations. I completely understand that. But when the fact of the matter, when actual policy decisions need to be made that actually impact international politics or even regional dynamics, China, for their own decision and their own validity, does not want to be the lead of it. They never take up that mantle. And I don't see Xi Jinping outside of pageantry, outside of hosting summits, really doing anything substantially different. Yes, he's playing a key role in his support for Russia and the invasion of Ukraine, and that has been very much highlighted. That has caused a lot more problems than I think people realize within the European Union Chinese relationship that Trump is trying to, beat that to a dead horse. And so I think we need to be cognizant of the limitations, both because of inability and lack of desire of China to really be the supplemental power and the true sense of the matter. They will always be a great place for a lot of meetings and pageantry and maybe some diplomatic discussions, etc. But I don't even see Xi Jinping wanting to take the mantle that the United States, even with President Trump, who is probably the most isolationist president we've had, at least in a rhetorical sense, in his rhetoric, since prior to World War II, even at this prime opportunity, we haven't necessarily seen China do much to change the calculations on the ground in actual policy and international relations.
So this is where I agree that this is not sort of a driving factor. I don't think the SEO is a driving factor. I think it is an indicator. And I don't think that China's goal is to replace the United States. But what I do think is they want to establish their own regional supremacy and hierarchy. And, we see that with the Nine Dash Line, South China Sea. And we've kind of lost track. I don't know if we've even spoken about it so much on this podcast, but we are well overdue to have a conversation about the South China Sea. I think what we're seeing is a chipping away of the current global policy sort of paradigm and status quo. And in that, China is the revisionist power. India is a revisionist power. Russia is a revisionist power. And they're all doing, undertaking their own policies to achieve that. But seeing them coalesce is an indicator that the United States is losing influence, and we don't want to just turn away from these powers. I know diplomacy and foreign policy is never really like the highlight for a lot of people, a lot of American voters, but there are some really worrying indicators that the US is losing some influence. And that's not something that we're going to see immediately, but down the road, this is something that we need to continue to watch. And I don't think we can just um, shake it off and say like, well, nothing's going to come out of this, because I tend to agree, not much is going to come out of this meeting, but it indicates a trend and a worrisome trend at that.
I would, I agree with you, and it's kind of this double-edged sword because there's some areas where obviously harsh line rhetoric doesn't work. I mean, we've seen Trump take a very harsh tone recently against India, which the Indians have not buckled in any way, shape, or form. And they kind of continue down. But unfortunately, I think it's also important to highlight that some of this harsh rhetoric actually has produced positive results, at least from a U.S. foreign policy perspective, and that's Panama, in the Panama Canal. We have, and actually, Southcom has recently, a couple weeks ago, conducted extensive bilateral military training in Panama specifically for the purpose of the defense of the Panama Canal. And so I think this is where scenarios where in some areas it's going to backfire horribly and it's going to be terrible. And I think India is a perfect example where it has not served U.S. interests and how President Trump has handled it. Others, there's probably more areas of success, such as Panama. But again, I think this is a question that is kind of up for debate, and I think that is why we're going to continue to look at it and see the role of China. But before we wrap, I do want to go, Matt, to our last topic of the conversation that we really wanted to talk about, which was this Israeli strike against the Houthi political and military leadership, where significant portions of the Houthis, the prime minister was assassinated in Israeli airstrikes. Uh, Other cabinet members within the Houthi government were assassinated, and elements within the Houthi Ministry of Defense were also killed. I mean, this operation shows that even with Israel's renewed offensive into Gaza City, right, now going full swing again, the Houthi-Israel conflict continues to this day. And just today, as this of the recording, which is Sunday, the 7th of September, a Houthi drone did impact a small Israeli airport in southern Israel. So clearly the Israelis will probably respond. Matt, it's looking like, there's no real possibility of a ceasefire. Israel is going to continue its offensive in Gaza and intensify it. And this military airstrike that Israel did against Houthi really decapitated the political and ministry defense leadership aspect of it. My question for you, Matt, is: do you think that this is going to have an actual impact within the Houthi government and military infrastructure, or is this a scenario where the political leadership and even some members of the Ministry of Defense really don't have that much power per se in the day-to-day operations of Houthi strikes against Israel?
So I think one of the things that you mentioned, we did see that they launched a drone strike against a rival's terminal at a smaller airport along the Red Sea in Israel. Israel's strike was very surgical, and one of the things that I think is worth pointing out is just how feckless this makes Saudi Arabia and the GCC coalition that was combating the Houthis look. Um, Israel is doing this from afar. They don't have the same history there, and they're able to conduct a strike that is arguably a bigger win than the Saudis saw in the whole of the conflict that started back in 2014. So I think that's one thing to point out. Second thing, the Houthis are a movement, so I don't think this is going to do anything that is necessarily going to undermine the movement of the Houthis. But unless someone goes in on the ground, I don't think that it's going to change anything in the long run in terms of their hold on Sana'a and that portion of the country. And I think there are elements within the Houthis that are going to continue uh, their fight just as they have been doing. Um, I don't know how much the decapitation of the leadership is going to affect the organization as a whole. I think you will see them maybe try and decentralize to prevent something like this from happening again. But I do think, we've talked about the grievances that they had. Those still exist. They're going to still exist, and I don't see the organization going away. And I do wonder how Israel, the United States, other countries can apply real pressure to the Houthis, or is it just a matter of continue these strikes and continue to degrade their capabilities and their leadership until we start to see more fractures among the organization?
I think we are seeing. I think the at least the internal aspect of the Yemeni civil war is continuing. I think a lot of that is probably slowly coming back again at the forefront. Um, you've highlighted this extensively of um, the presence of Al Qaeda in Yemen, which is obviously that is very significant. We've actually seen the internationally recognized government of Yemen has clashed with even Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula yesterday. Major clashes occurred there. So I think Yemen is obviously a problem set. We're analyzing it obviously from the Israeli Houthi perspective, but even just internal Yemeni conflict and dynamic and power dynamic is very interesting. Just recently, the Houthis yesterday killed a senior government commander in Marib as part of the internationally recognized government. We saw that again, the clashes with Al Qaeda between the Yemeni armed forces. And so it would be interesting to see that one of the areas I'm looking at is because of these strikes that Israel has done and some of these decapitation strikes, is this a scenario where the internationally recognized government tries to see if there's opportunities to kind of increase their influence because some of those conflicts are still going on inside of Yemen? Obviously, the Al Qaeda aspect is separate. But I am interested in that because we are seeing an increased amount of clashes along kind of the front lines between the internationally recognized government in Yemen and the Houthis. Those have increased. I'm wondering if Israel strikes against the Houthis might try to weaken in some way, shape, and again, they don't have necessarily the persistency to do this, unlike the United States. But do we start seeing a shift maybe in Israelis' military strategies, targeting key facilities, key military units that might weaken territorial hold that the Houthis have, specifically, south of Sana'a, related to the Yemeni armed forces of the international recognized government? That's the next area I'm looking at. But time will tell if that's actually a decision that Israel does, or if they just are focused more on just the capabilities of the Houthis in targeting Israel.
Yeah, I think that's actually the perfect thing to highlight, and that is where if we see that pivot, that is where you could start to see more changes on the ground. And you bring up the Al Qaeda aspect. I think another aspect that people should be focused on, or at least aware of, is something that we spoke about the proliferation of drone use among terrorist organizations. This attack on the airport is one example of that, but the Houthis have been sort of spreading a little bit of their influence into the Horn of Africa. And we spoke about that with um, ISIS in Somalia. They could be a sort of waypoint for some of the components and the technology behind the FPV drones, make it into the hands of some of these organizations and also a distributor of some of the Iranian technology. So I'd also be interested to see if, that could be a point of funding and a point of influence for them. Do we see any sort of strikes on that infrastructure as well? So those are two things that I would be watching in the near to midterm future.
Well, I think, Matt, I think what we highlight in this, there's always hotspots. I'm very happy that we did this global intel because there was a lot of things that we wanted to talk about. And obviously, I'm really interested in the Venezuela aspect. We've seen the Trump administration. I think if we used Israel and Iran as a key example, how quickly it went from just Israeli unilateral military operations against the Islamic Republic, then quickly involved the U.S. conducting strikes specifically against Iranian nuclear facilities. So I'm interested to see how quickly we might see from an area of increased military buildup to actual strikes in Venezuela. If I was a betting man, I think I would say we're probably closer to U.S. direct military involvement inside of Venezuela than probably most anticipated. And a lot of the reporting we're getting is kind of tied into that. But if that happens, we will definitely have a podcast episode to cover that. And because that would be a major, the first real at least counter narcotic military operations that the United States has conducted since the invasion of Panama.
All things to watch, and we will look to do more of these episodes where we take a broad perspective on several different topics, but we will continue to do our deep dives, and I think in the very near future we will have that conversation on Venezuela. But it's been great speaking with you as always, Stefano, and this has been the bottom line up front on our Torius podcast, and we will speak to you soon.